Hello, Stephen Shore. Thank you so much for being with us today. It's such a pleasure for me to welcome you. The conversation we are going to have today is taking place on the occasion of the Paul Strand exhibition that we have now at the Fondation Cartier-bresson in Paris until April 23rd. And we are going to talk about your relationship with Paul Strand. We are going to talk about his book, Un Paese, which is considered by many to be one of his most, maybe the most important book. And also we are going to talk about your own series of photographs that you took in Luzzara in 1993, which is, of course, deeply connected with Strand. So maybe let's start with a very basic question. We all know that Paul Strand is a great figure of the 20th century American photography. He was, in a way, two-time consecrated in 1917 first by Alfred Stieglitz, who dedicated the last issue of camera work to him, and also in 1945 when MoMA organized a retrospective, his first retrospective of his work. And so, Stephen, I would like to ask you, under what circumstances did you discover the work of Paul Strand, and what kind of relationship have you maintained during your career with his work?
First, Clément, thank you so much for inviting me to talk with you and about Paul Strand. The first book of his that I owned was Un Paese, and I would guess I was maybe 12 or 13 when I got it. I've had it for a long time. I think it's still that and Tirare Moraine are my two favorites, I think. But I really think Paese may be the one I felt closest to. But I've been aware of Strand for a while. One of my two closest friends when I was young, when I was 9, 10, was a boy named Tommy Hurwitz, whose father was Leo Hurwitz. And Leo Hurwitz was a friend of Strand's. Leo was the cinematographer on Lawrence's film, A Plow That Broke the Plains, along with Strand, but I think Leo was the chief cinematographer. He was a founder of
Frontier Film?
Yes, I think so, yes.
Mm-hmm.
And so when I first met Leo, would be in the mid-50s, and he had recently been blacklisted for his communist ties. So I was aware of Strand, and Leo knew I was interested in photography and mentioned Strand to me. I was aware of Strand, and I was aware of Strand's politics from a very early age, probably by the time I was 10. And I've had the book as far, I don't remember when I got it. I've had it as far back as I can. I remember there are a few books that I got around the same time. The French edition of The Americans, the E. Via publication of Auger.
Uh-huh.
When I first started expanding my interest in the history of photography, I collected a lot of books.
That's interesting. So you were first connected to the work of Strand through Horvitz, through the book. Did you remember what was your first impression when you look at Un Paese? How did you?
You're asking me for my first impression from 65 years ago. I really don't remember. But I loved his portraits.
Uh-huh.
I liked the kind of program he set out for himself of portraits, artifacts, landscapes, and architecture.
Mm-hmm.
Although Un Paese has very little architecture in it.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And we can talk about that later if you want.
So you were aware that clearly Strand was a leftist.
Yes.
He was a member of the Labour Party. He was associated with several organizations that were considered as subversive and un-American during the McCarthyism period. So that was something that was completely clear for you.
Yes.
Was it also clear that Luzzara had a very strong history, that it was a place that was really a high place for the resistance during the Second World War, the resistance to fascism? Was it clear that what is super interesting when you start studying the whole story of Un Paese is that Luzzara was a communist town. The mayor was, it was run by a communist mayor. And the book was published also by Giulio Einaudi, who is also known for his leftist sympathies. So was it also something that was clear for you at the time? You were very young.
I mean, as I said, his political sympathies were clear to me because of my friendship with Tommy Horowitz, and through Tommy, I had a number of conversations over the years with his father. It wasn't like he was some shadow figure. He was a very open and generous person. And when Tommy and I were classmates at a school together, and then I moved to a different school. I moved out of the city, and then I came back. And the school I then attended for the next 4 years happened to be on the block that Tommy and Leo lived. And so I continued my friendship all during that period. But in terms of the town itself, I knew nothing. And the book I had was in Italian, and so I couldn't read the text. And no, I had no knowledge of the history of the town.
Last question about the political commitment of Strand. How did you feel with the fact that he was a leftist, that he has a very strong communist sympathy, and then that he was clearly engaged? I mean, that was America. That was America during a period where it was not so easy to be a communist. And so, how did you react to that? Was it you knew that he was deeply engaged into that he left the U.S. to come to France to avoid being having trouble with McCarthyism? So how did you react to that?
Well, the environment I grew up in, the school that I went to when I was between the ages of 7 and maybe 10, was a very liberal school. One of my classmates, also aside from Tommy, was Bobby Miller, whose father was the playwright Arthur Miller, who was was leftist, and so Leo was this kind person, and so I didn't. If you're asking, did I see him through the filter of American McCarthyism? Absolutely not. American McCarthyism was, if the subject ever came up in conversation, this was anathema.
Okay. No, that's great.
So my view certainly was never negatively colored by. But let me say this: I have aesthetic issues with it, which is that his view of the village was colored by this, and I know you have a bunch of questions, and I'm going to give you. You've only gotten one question into this, but I'm going to give you a longer answer than you are counting on.
Good.
So I had a friend named Tony Hiss, and he was a writer for the New Yorker, And in 1973, he interviewed Paul Strand. And I'm going to read you part of what Strand said. And to put it into my own personal context, this was published in the New Yorker in March of 73. This is 4 months before I began my series, Uncommon Places. And Tony asks Strand about the importance of feeling in a good photograph. And Strand replies, "What is more important than feeling is understanding. Feeling is a very good way, a very easy way to escape reality. As far as I'm concerned, you can have 2 world wars roll over you and not notice because you're so interested in your feelings. I don't think the artist grows by feeling. I think he grows by understanding. He only grows by being compelled to do certain things, whether he wants to do them or not. There's a tremendous weakness in only doing what you want to do. When I was in the Hebrides, where cattle are very important, taking pictures, what if I had said, I like stones, but I don't like cows, and had only taken pictures of stones? I was, of course, forced to take pictures of everything in the Hebrides if I wanted to tell the story of the Hebrides. And I did. And I know, I'm absolutely sure of it, that this is the only way an artist grows. The reason for this is very simple. If the matrix of an artist's work is reality to start with, and not feeling, and not imagination, and not the things he dreams, or as I put it vulgarly, sucks out of his own gut. If that's the matrix of his work, it's absolutely inexhaustible, because it's the whole world. I read this at the time. I thought it was just a marvelous statement.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And I can't help but think that it influenced me as I traveled across the country and wanted to see what was there. I'm bringing this up now because this is not what he did in Luzzara. He had an agenda. He was looking for the idealistic agrarian village and wanted to present it as such. He was there in 53. I was there exactly to the month 40 years later, in 93. He photographed the village presented in the book is not the village of 53, it's the village of 40 years before. It's the village of 1913. There are no cars. There are no power lines.
So he was trying to represent Luzzara as a village of the first half of the 20th century, a village before the war.
Yeah.
Because his idea was, he wanted to find, that's the same with New England, the book he made in New England in 45 with Nancy Newell.
Yes.
Or the book he published on the Hebrides Islands with Bruce Davidson. It's the idea of finding places that are...
Basil Davidson.
Basil Davidson, yeah, sorry. Sorry. So the idea is really to find a place which show this agrarian moment in terms of development, something which is pre-capitalism, something which is pre the industrialization of the country, and he was looking for something like that when he was searching for this place with Cesare Zavattini. Yeah, that's super interesting. So for you, including the cars, including the electric poles, were important. I remember that there is a huge discussion in American photography. This is not something that we have in France, but I remember some texts by Walker Evans or even by John Sharkovsky. And I even remember a text by Sharkovsky where he's talking about the discussion with Walker Evans, where he's talking about this question of including the electric poles, including the power lines in the image. And I remember that Sharkovsky is saying that the first time he met with Walker Evans, and Sharkovsky was a photographer before becoming the MoMA head of the photography department. He was himself a photographer, and he showed some of his photographs to Evans, and Evans said to him, "That's great. You kept the electric lines in the image. That's great. And so was it something important for you, this question of the power line and electric poles and all these questions for your generation? Was it something important?
Oh yes, and if you look at my pictures from the 70s, not only are power lines important, they're almost an essential structural element in the picture.
That's great. That's super interesting. And it was not for Strand. That was really
Strand.
Yeah, a generational gap or big difference between the two generations. So let's talk.
I'm sorry. Let me interrupt you. I'm sorry to interrupt you, Clément. But when you said generational gap, it made me think of something else, which is that when I began this project in Luzzara, the photographic historian Paolo Constantini, who was a friend of mine, sent me a copy of a letter that Strand had written to a friend in the States while he was working there, saying how difficult it was to photograph in Luzzara because there were no buildings of architectural interest. And what I got from that was a generational difference, that in the two generations that separated us, the meaning of the term architectural interest had evolved significantly. And for Strand, it was either a building like a beautiful New England church that was fine architecture, or a rudimentary hand-built stone hut in the Hebrides that was an expression of humanity, where maybe the next generation took anonymous architecture and understood it in modernist terms, like Evans.
Yeah.
And for me, it was, I see all kinds of trends in society. I see cultural forces, economic forces, sociological forces, and I can't photograph them unless they become visible. And they become visible and accessible to me in architecture. And so the idea that there would be a building that is of no architectural interest is almost meaningless to me.
That's super interesting. Let's move to 1993, when Linea di Confine invited you to come and photograph Luzzara. Linea di Confine is an organization based in the Reggio Emilia, founded by Guido Guidi, Paolo Costantini. You were just talking about him. He was a very important historian and curator, and also Paolo Costantini and William Guerrieri. And they have done an amazing job in terms of photographing the Reggio Emilia, asking to more than 40 photographers from Italy, but also from all over the world, to come to Italy to document the area and its inhabitants. So that was a very important program. You have never been to Luzzara before this project, and that was the first time that you were, in a way, working on a project walking in the footsteps of another photographer. That was for you the first time that you were doing that. So can you tell us a bit more about how did you approach this new challenge for you?
That Paolo and William invited me was, I had known them for a while, and they were assigning a photographer to each of the towns in Reggio Emilia. And they knew that Luzzara was on the list, that Paolo, of course, was well aware that it was the 40th anniversary of Strand's visit, so he thought, why not get an American photographer who used a view camera to come. I wasn't asked to do a re-photographic survey of his work, but just to come. On the other hand, I couldn't pretend I didn't know his work. Un Paese was one of the first photographic books I'd ever owned, and knew it and loved it. But I also understood by that time the limitations of it that I had just mentioned. And I wanted to come to Luzzara and see what was there. I, however, did have my own agenda, which was this. 2 years before, I spent some time photographing in the Yucatan in Mexico. And I wanted to photograph traditional culture under the pressure of transition. And in the Yucatan villages, the small villages, the older generation spoke Mayan and not even Spanish. The their grandchildren spoke Spanish and no Mayan. They watched television and wore Nikes. And in one home, you would see this, the pressure of modernization in Western culture happening. But people still had a strong root in tradition. The buildings were all built in a architectural style that had not changed really since in 1,500 years or 1,200 years, actually. Although they had been electrified and now had television sets. There was still a lot of customs in the village where the presence of tradition was still present. And I was interested in what that looked like. I had it in my mind that I wanted to find a similar kind of transition to modernity, but with the constant respect and presence of tradition, but not in a third world culture, in a first world culture. And so while Strand had his agenda, I had mine. And so the reason there are a lot of pictures of bicycles, people on bicycles, as well as cars, is that, in fact, the presence of tradition is still there. People still ride around on bicycles. People still go down to the Po and look out on the river with their family. And so I was interested in seeing and being sensitive to the lingering presence of traditional culture, but in a first world setting.
I understand. But tell me something. Strand is not using so much the word documentary photography. He prefers to talk about realism. He's talking in a text that he wrote a few years before Un Paese. He's talking about dynamic realism, which is for him a way to represent the humblest human being in all their dignity and historical importance. And in this, he's completely in phase, completely linked to what Cesare Zavattini, who is writing the text for the book, was also interested in. Zavattini was an important theoretician of the neo-realism, so that was completely in sync with that. Can you tell us what was your own approach in terms of photography, in terms of realism or documentary photography? I would love to put some words on that, because the question of the wording of the approach is so important. You describe it before in your previous answer, but can you tell us a bit more about the word you will use to define your approach at that time?
I'm going to give you an unhelpful answer, which is I didn't apply a word to it. Document is such a tricky word.
Yeah.
I'm the head of the photo department at Bard College, and a couple of years ago we had a lecture series where I wanted to hear, the theme was, what is a document? And I invited Alex Soth, whose approach is, I would say, similar to mine, in that we understand the distorting possibilities of photography, but also understand that a real perception can be communicated by it. We had Martha Rossler, who created scenes, sometimes through collage and other means, that don't look anything like a document, but I think she felt were documenting. We had Walid Rad, who creates a seamless but artificial document. We had Wendell White. Do you know Wendell White's work?
Yes, yes.
Who was interested in working with archives and had very specific and documentary intent, documenting early Black culture usually in the Northeast. And we had Terence Simon, who has thought as much as anyone about the limitations of photography. And if you want to put a thought across and communicate a complex thought, what you have to do it in terms of combining photograph, text, documentary material, and how to combine it either through graphic design or through installation. And so these are completely different approaches to the document because the word is so tricky.
Yeah, I understand. And it's probably part of the problem, because nobody wants to put a word on it. So it exists, but it's very difficult to talk about it. And it's part of the history of photography now. There is a huge tradition of something that has no name. And it's something which is super, super interesting. There is a kind of resistance to define this kind of approach between documentary style, post-documentary approach, realism, and we have quite an interesting list of words, but nobody wants to try to define exactly what it is and what would be the right word to define this moment. It's interesting.
Yeah, it's very interesting. I mean, photography, there's just something about a photograph that we know that it's a truncation of the world. And we know as photographers, some of the postmodernists were interested in how different a photograph is from the world. Mm-hmm. But the photographers of a generation before, or two generations before, understood it completely. We understood how that truncation works, and then used it to communicate, use that understanding to communicate what we wanted to communicate.
Yeah.
That we didn't base the work, that the work wasn't about the truncation necessarily, was because we accepted it as these are the ground rules. These are the tools we're playing with. Now what do we do with them? Oh. And yet there's something when you look at a photograph that, it's there. And I think about, we're wandering far off Strand.
Yeah.
Rembrandt did a painting of an Arab sheikh. Now we know that it was a neighbor of his dressed in a turban and with some jewels. And it's a wonderful portrait. F. Hollanday dresses like an Arab and goes into his studio. And I look at the picture and I can't help thinking it is some guy dressed like an Arab in a studio in Rochester. I just can't get over it. There's something so literal about a picture in a way that I can't pretend, even though, and I know that Rembrandt wasn't painting a real Arab, but because painting doesn't have that almost forced literality, I can make that jump. And I just find it very hard with the photograph.
Let's continue on this question of you said truncation, and I think that's super interesting. In an interview with David Company, you said that you had a lunch with Paul Strand at one point, probably sometimes in the 70s, and that he told you that it was not possible to evoke the highest emotions in color.
Yes.
And I wanted to ask you, is it the reason why you have photographed Luzzara in black and white when most of your work is, in fact, in color?
It's not the reason.
Okay.
So Strand and I were represented by the same gallery in New York, Light Gallery. And I had a show up, and he came, and we went out to lunch together. And he was just trying to give me good advice from a person that, 60 years older, or 50 years older. I guess it was almost 60 years older. That he said, higher emotions can't be communicated in color. And I'm adding in my memoir. I'm doing a new edition of it that will come out in September, where I've written about this event. And around the corner from where we had lunch, in the same building as Light Gallery, was a bookstore called Wittenborn, who also published books. And they published Kandinsky's book concerning the spiritual in art, which I had read at the time. Uh-huh. And in it he says that color is the gateway to the soul. I took what Strand said as this is his background, this is where he's coming from. But I didn't take that to heart and continued to. Our lunch was in 72, maybe 73. I continued to do color. The reason Luzzara was in black and white is when I had finished the project in the Yucatan in 1971, I realized that I had been working only in color for the previous 20 years. And that when I started, there were only a handful of people working seriously in color. And over that 20 years, things changed, and now no one was using black and white. So I decided in 1972, and rather 1992, that for the next decade, I would work in black and white. I'd been teaching for 10 years and teaching black and white printing, and realized I was a much better black and white printer than I ever had been when I was using black and white in the 60s. And so it just fell within that time. That was my black and white decade.
I would like now to discuss with you an image from the book that is that I found of great poetic power. This is an image where there is 3 men and 2 boys. There is also a bicycle wheel, which is perhaps not insignificant here. The scene takes place probably on the banks of a river that I can guess is probably the Po River, and they are watching the flow of the river as maybe someone would watch time pass. And I just wanted to ask you, why did you choose to open the book with that specific image?
I also found it a very powerful image, and I found it a very powerful moment. As I mentioned a while back, I was attuned to the presence of tradition in modern life there. And the life was modern. Like, the butcher wore Gucci loafers, and there were Italians. They're stylish, and I'd go into a building with peeling paint on the outside, and there were black glass tables with Macintosh computers lined up. But I was attuned to, in the interest of being in the modern world, I think the people there liked that contrast, that they liked having the 10 layers of paint on the outside of the building and having this stark modern interior, and that there was a relishing of the tradition. It was imbued in there, and that moment seemed like just such a touching moment, where probably that time, if you were to travel to New York City, people might be watching television. There may be some people in New York sitting out by the East River fishing in it. That does happen. But it just seemed like such a, as you said, it was. There are occasionally moments that seem like they come out of an experience of the past, almost like they come out of our collective unconscious. A moment that is timeless. And that moment felt timeless to me.
Beautiful. There are images in your book that clearly evoke those of strands, and I'm thinking of those bundles of willow sticks, or those men on bicycles under the trees. One of the probably the most striking photograph of Strand in the book. And so you said at that time that you didn't want to go into a re-photographic survey project that was very important at that time in the US, but you didn't want to. You make it clear that it was not about re-photographing the places where Strand has been in the 50s. So how did you find the right distance between Strand's places and the places you choose to photograph?
I would say a combination of instinct and that knowledge that was an issue, that I can't pretend I didn't see these pictures that I've known all of my photographic life. One of the first photographic books I've owned. I also wanted to see modern life there. And for example, there's a photograph of a young boy with like a patterned acrylic shirt leaning against a Land Rover. I mean, Strand would never have even vaguely considered taking this picture. At the same time, just as I was critical of Strand of cutting out all modern life from his book, the traditional life was still present there. I mean, people went down to the Po to look out at the river. They ride on their bicycles. They gather twigs in the same way as their grandfathers did. And so I didn't want to pretend that, not only didn't I not want to pretend that the tradition had been wiped out, I was actually, one of my main interests was seeing where traditional rituals, behaviors, cultural attributes still were alive. And which is one of the reasons I loved the place.
There are many bicycles in Strand's and Zavattini's book. And of course, I was saying before that Zavattini was the writer of the famous film, The Bicycle Thief, which is an amazing film. And Zavattini is, who is the co-author of the book, wrote the screenplay for that film. So there is a kind of unconscious of the bicycle in Luzzara, and there is one of your photograph in the book that reminds me a lot of both the bicycle thieves, but also of the book Un Paese. You photograph a street corner, and suddenly there is a man on a bicycle that appear, and we can see in the image that there is a kind of speed. I mean, the guy is not posing for you. There is clearly, it probably just appear when you were framing the photograph. And so, as the director of the Fondation cartier-bresson, I can't avoid thinking about the famous photograph of Henri Cartier-Bresson in Hyères in 1932, where the bicycle is entering the image, and it's a bit blurry, but the bicycle is almost in the middle. And of course, this is not this kind of unconscious which is in your photograph. It's much more something which is related to Zavattini, to Luzzara, to Un Paese, that is apparently resurfacing in this photograph. So can you tell us about the circumstances in which you took that picture?
I'm going to give you an answer that may seem ridiculously matter of fact. So since between 1973 and when I switched to black and white, I'd been using a film that had an ISO of 160, and I always thought color film was overrated, and so I always shot it at 100 ISO. So now I put 400 speed film into my camera. That means I have 2 more stops of exposure to play with. Instead of shooting at a 30th of a second, I can shoot at 125th of a second. I can take a picture of, I can't refocus because it's a view camera. So I have to focus, hold the focus, put the dark slide in. But I could take a picture of a young mother and her baby and not have them hold still. As long as they didn't move forward or backward, I can stop action. And so part of what I was doing for myself was just relishing what I could do with 2 extra stops of exposure. After almost 2 decades of being limited and perhaps never taking a picture faster than a 30th of a second in 20 years, or 15 years, all of a sudden being able to shoot at a 60th, 125th of a second. And so I can stop someone coming around a corner on a bicycle.
But were you expecting that someone will come?
I don't think so.
No,
I don't recall. No. But I could. If I'm set up,
you're ready to shoot, and suddenly
I was going to shoot the scene whether he came by or not. And then so I'm standing there with the camera, and all of a sudden he's there, so I take a picture. It's just one of those fortuitous things that photographers take advantage of.
But you were on a tripod at that time. I mean, it's not an handheld camera; it's clearly on a tripod. Okay.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah.
Interesting. In the vast majority of his portraits, Strand is facing his subject. You clearly prefer an oblique view. Was this something important? I mean, it's clear that on most of your portrait, you were talking about the guy with his shirt in front of a car, where it's also a kind of oblique view. And so I just wanted to talk here again about a kind of gap between your generation and the generation of Strand. Was it something important for you to differentiate yourself from this generation of Strand, but also Walker Evans, where the question of the frontality of being really, of facing the subject was so important?
I don't really think it was on my mind. I was just taking the portraits that intuitively I wanted to take. I wasn't trying to create a separation. I was aware of, for example, a separation in what I was photographing. So as I described, I was aware when I was photographing that boy that this is not a picture Strand would have taken. But I wasn't thinking about differentiating myself in terms of whether I put a person against a wall and have them look straight at the camera or not.
But do you agree that the idea of facing the subject is much easier because you don't have to take any decision? The decision is made by, you just have to be frontal. You just have to be in face of it. But as soon as you start finding an oblique view, a view from the side, then you have to choose which angle is the right one. Is it, and so do you agree with the idea that it's much more easier frontality for a photographer is much more easier because there is no decision?
It's easier formally, but what I find striking about Strand's portraits is his human perception and what he saw in the people. And that's not easy.
There is another photograph in the book that really struck me. It is one of the last photograph of the book, and we see 2 sections of a kind of cement wall. I'm thinking that maybe it's 2 books in a metaphorical way. 2 books side by side. One could be Un Paese and the other one could be your Luzzara book. But when I look closer at this photograph, I didn't saw it at first. It took me a while to see that in between the 2 walls, there is an eye that appears, an eye that look at me when I'm looking at the photograph. An eye which is maybe a rooster eye. Is that correct?
That's correct.
Okay. And when I was completely fascinated by this photograph when I discovered that the eye was right, almost right in the middle, in between these two walls, and I was wondering if when you took that photograph, the idea that it could be the eye of Strand looking at you and then looking at the viewer of the book came to your mind as it came to my mind when when I discovered that the eye was there right in the middle.
It did not come to my mind. I mean, what I was thinking
Okay.
about was I saw these chickens behind the wall and thinking, now that I'm using this faster film, could I get a picture? And also the difficulty of I can't have the rooster hold still while I focus. So, and the camera was like, I put the tripod, spread the legs out so I could get as low to the ground as I could get, and focused a little beyond the opening and just waited for a rooster to come by. And so there was so much logistics involved. I think that's all I was thinking about.
That's great. Uh, I like your very pragmatic approach of it. When I'm much more projecting imagination, culture, and things like that, and metaphors in the photograph. Thank you so much, Stephen. It's always such a pleasure to talk with you, and thank you so much for this amazing Luzzara book, which is really such a companion to Un Paese. It's really great to look at both together. Um, we have the Luzzara photograph by Paul Strand on view at the Fondation Cartier-bresson until April 23rd. And I hope that soon we will be able to look at some of your photograph on the walls of the Fondation. Thank you so much for your time. It was, as always, a
Thank you,
pleasure.
Clément. And for me, always a pleasure too.